I worked on the first Jak and Daxter. That was the first game I worked on for this company. I was brought in as an animator. They had already kind of gotten into production on it. And I was brought in specifically to animate the cinematics, which is something that was different for them. When they were a smaller company, it was kind of like everybody did a little bit of everything. If you sort of had to be a jack of all trades, so to speak, because they wanted to have a focus on some of these cinematics. They really wanted to have people dedicated to them. So it was myself and another fellow named Jordan Pichon, who were the two cinematic animators at the very beginning. Yeah, you know what? They did some amazing stuff with the Crash game animation, given the limitations at the time. The first Crash Bandicoot I remember seeing, I was actually working at a different game company. This was back in, I guess, 1995, 96. I remember seeing the first Crash Bandicoot and thinking like, oh my God, how the hell are they actually doing that? And they were really smart about it. They designed their character in such a way that they could get really broad, expressive detail with these very, very simple shapes. They weren't trying to do this incredibly complicated, realistic-looking character. Yeah, their stuff was really inspiring then, particularly the Crash dance. And then, you know, when I came to interview at the studio, whenever you interview here, you usually also have to take a test of some sort. So I came to the studio to do a animation test. And when I was here, I was looking at the animation that they had done so far and seeing the worlds that they'd made with the Jak game. And it was kind of mind-blowing, honestly. And I wish they had shown that to me after the fact, because I saw the animation and I was like, oh shit. And then I had to sit there and do this animation test. It was kind of intimidating, but I passed the test apparently because I'm still here.
What was the test?
I was just animating a character in a scene. It was about like a little 10-second dialogue clip. Just wanted to see how far I could get with it. But yeah, I fooled them all. So here I am. My background was actually working in film and television animation. So it was sort of it was very similar to what I had been doing before. I hadn't had any real experience doing gameplay animation, which is really an entirely different and much more technical beast. And I just had an affinity for it, so that's what I kept on doing for it over the years. And then after Jak 1, they'd made me the cinematic lead on Jak 2, which wasn't really out of like necessarily being the best animator. I don't ever think I was. It was more that I was most organized. Jason, near the end of Jak, when production was getting a little bit crazy and everybody's trying to keep track of everything, I sat down and like made an Excel sheet showing like what we had left to do. And I don't know, I guess Jason saw that. It was like, huh, you kind of seem to be organized. Why don't you manage the department too? I was like, so that's kind of how that all started.
Do you want to talk about the tools that you used to actually animate Jak and Daxter? What were those like? How rudimentary were they?
I mean, our tools were a lot simpler back then, but mostly because they didn't need to be super complicated. I mean, we were not working with motion capture. Everything was hand keyed. We didn't have to do anything super complex with like, you know, skin deformations and wrinkles and muscles and things like that. It was this very cartoony and stylized animation. You know, we had particular tools, but, you know, nothing too out of the ordinary that you wouldn't have seen at any other studio. I mean, it was really when we started working on Uncharted and started working with motion capture that we really had to step up our game in that department.
Are you sure you want to be defiling your ancestors' remains like that?
Going from stylized cartoony animation to realistic animation is night and day, apples and oranges, whatever other comparison you want to make kind of difference. You know, when you're doing stylized animation, you can get away with a lot more. You can define your own rules. You can define your own laws of gravity in some way, as long as it looks convincing, as long as the performances look real. But when you're animating characters that look like realistic people, you don't have nearly as much leeway because our brains are designed to register like when things look wrong with other people. So if you have somebody moving in an unnatural way, it's going to, at best, sort of like take you out of the moment, and at worst, it's going to creep you out. That's where the whole uncanny valley aspect comes from. So that was a huge struggle. And at the beginning, all the animators resisted big time. We really wanted to maintain keyframe animation. And Jeremy Yates, one of our best animators, tried a number of different realistic human run cycles and walk cycles, trying to get those to like look right. And eventually he did, but it just took a long time. It's stiff, it doesn't quite look natural. And I mean, you can get there eventually, but the fact is motion capture gives us a huge leg up. And that was really the initial resistance from a lot of the animators. You're just like, we don't want to work with motion capture. It's like, it's like tracing. It's like cheating. We want to create these performances ourselves. And I think every animator at one point or another threatened to quit because they didn't want to work with motion capture. But after a while, and after trying to do tests of our own, we just sort of came to the realization, this is really a useful tool. And a lot of the resistance to motion capture came from the idea that a lot of people, not here at the studio, but a lot of the people in the industry saw motion capture as like the be-all, end-all solution. It's like, we don't need animators anymore. We can just have actors act it out. We can just drop it in the game and we'll be done. And it's like, no, and that was never the case. And that's why when we developed our working techniques on stage, it was important to us to do the performance capture where we are getting both the physical performance and the vocal performance simultaneously. So you get that and then you bring it back to the animators, and then the animators take that performance and enhance it.
So when you're talking about the difficulty of getting the run cycle, are you mocapping even the walks and stuff like that?
We are, but it's a little different for cinematics and gameplay. Cinematics, we let the actors do their performances, and sometimes we make minor adjustments on set, and then when we bring them back, we're doing a lot of little performance tweaks and things like that. But with the gameplay animation, what you're getting is really a base to work from. Nolan North's a really good actor, but you can't tell him to run exactly 3 meters a second, no matter how hard you try. So what you do is you get him to run, and then you take that and use that as your first layer. And then you tweak the timing, you tweak the positions of the arms and the legs, you tweak the impact, and you keep on developing that, and then you make it so that it looks nice when it loops over and over again. So motion capture for the gameplay animation really is just like more of a starting point than anything else. The principles of animation still apply to when you're working with motion capture or whether you're working with hand keyframe. It's just that, you're getting something to start with instead of starting from scratch. But the fact is, the timing is still very much an important aspect of it, obviously. And when you get motion capture data back, a lot of the times when you're just looking at it, it sometimes looks a little bit floaty. That's just sort of the nature of it. So if we want characters to point emphatically, on stage, it might look like this, but maybe what we'll do is we'll take a few frames out of it so it darts in a little bit faster.
Why do you think it looks floaty?
It just kind of does. It's kind of hard to explain.
Do you understand why it does, though? Or do you understand what the translation issue is?
It's not really a question of understanding. It's more just like when you animate, you are enhancing reality. Right? You're not trying to recreate reality because reality is boring and unimaginative. So if you really want somebody to look angry and look emphatic, you're going to amp up their motions a little bit to really sort of sell that point. And, it looks okay if you just leave it in with what the motion capture does, but it looks better if you can enhance it. And that's why the skill of our animators is so important. Even more so on the facial animation because we have never used facial motion capture. So that has to be created from scratch still all the time. And the decision to do that was, at the time, at the first Uncharted, largely because facial mocap in 2006 really sucked. The fact is, we could have used it. We probably would have spent more time cleaning it up to look halfway decent than we would have just to start from scratch. So when we shoot our scenes, we have all these video cameras that are taking reference of the actors, and the animators use that as reference for when they're animating their faces.
And so then why stick with that as the technology for mocap for the faces got better and better?
Well, one, because we had a good thing going, and two, the fact is adding face capture to the pipeline is not a trivial task. It's something that you have to do on stage. It's something that adds to the editing process and editing time. And just really, even though face capture technology did continue to get better, it's still not cheap, and it's still not as fast. And for us, one of the things that you can do with face capture is recreate the performance and the look of a specific actor. That's why you have a lot of modern games doing face scanning and doing all these sort of things. And that's not something that we do. Our characters are original creations. And the fact of the matter is, if we scan Nolan North's head and then applied it to Drake's face, it might look a little funny because their facial structure is not exactly the same. So you have it in feature film, where you're trying to recreate the look of a specific actor, and for that it's absolutely perfect. Or if you're looking at a film like the Planet of the Apes movies, obviously they're doing facial capture and everything there, but again, that facial capture is kind of like a starting point for their animators. They've got the video footage of the actors doing their thing, they have the bits of the face moving around, but the animators still have to go in there and add all that subtlety and nuance that sometimes the mocap just doesn't get.
Do you think it's a potent mix? Do you think there's something really special in the combination of capturing their bodies and then hand animating the faces?
It wasn't really sort of a conscious choice to do that for artistic reasons. It was largely just for practical reasons. When we started, face capture technology was expensive and not very good, but body capture animation was fairly well established and had a good pipeline, and we could really work with it. The fact is, Naughty Dog has always put a very strong focus on animation in their games, and a lot of studios don't. And what that meant was that Sony gave us the resources that we needed to have a strong and large animation crew to do all that hand key facial animation. If we had only 2 animators at the studio, then we probably would have used facial capture because it wouldn't have been realistic to do it with. Or likewise, if we had a 3,000-page script like Mass Effect, where it's like all talking that could not possibly be physically animated by hand in time for release, then we also probably would have investigated some other choices too. But for us, it was important for us to really handcraft the performances, and luckily Sony agreed and gave us the resources to do it. The Last of Us was largely the same approach as the Uncharted series. The big difference really being that with The Last of Us, we started experimenting with virtual camera setups as well, where you're actually creating a camera rig that's weighted to feel like an actual camera, and you're going in and shooting your motion capture. Like they go and shoot the motion capture on stage, they'd choose the takes that they wanted from the performances, and they'd recreate it. And then we would go back to the stage, and in this virtual setup, they would play back the performances while Shauna Sky, the cinematics lead, actually went around with the camera rig and sort of filmed it. And for The Last of Us, that was a little bit more important. Uncharted's camera work has always had a little bit more of like a classic, I'd say, like a romantic adventure movie feel, where lots of dollies and pans and that particular thing, much more in like a Spielberg mode. Whereas The Last of Us, they wanted to feel a lot more grounded and gritty, so they went for more of a cinema verite thing, where there's a lot more handheld feel. You're in a lot closer to the characters, and you want to feel like you are there with them. And so that approach really worked out well for them. And I mean, honestly, if people are mistaking it for facial capture, that's kind of a compliment. Doing good, realistic human facial animation is hard, and it's time-consuming, and that's why a lot of people go to face capture. So what we do is we just go over it with a real fine-tooth comb, and we have frequent review sessions. We're always looking at the video footage. We're not necessarily attempting to emulate the video footage 100%, but it's always going back saying like, okay, what was the actor's intent, and how do we want to convey that on this character? Again, largely because our characters are not one-to-one matches for the characters in the game. You'll note that Sam doesn't really look like Troy Baker, so we have to interpret it our own way.
So when you look back at Uncharted 1, what stands out to you as far as the animation goes?
Everybody looks like plastic dolls. Animation-wise, it's a little rough, but it was the first game we had ever done with realistic human characters, so we were learning. And we were learning a lot. There's still some scenes in that game that I think look pretty good, and there's still some scenes in that game where it's like, how did we let this ship like this? But I think that's just true anytime you finish a game. I mean, as the saying goes, art is never completed, only abandoned, right? So you have to ship, and there's certain things that you ship with that you're not happy with, and you go back and you look at it a few weeks later or a few years later, and you're like, oh God, why do we? Ugh. But that's just sort of the fact of the matter is. But I think for our first stab at it, I still look back at it pretty fondly.
So you talk about the plastic dolls. Is that in the movement or in like the facial textures?
No, it's strictly in the shading and lighting technology. It was just early days for our game engine. The fact that we got a running game out the door was due to a Herculean effort on our artistic and programming staff. And, right after we finished Uncharted 1, we had this laundry list of like, okay, here's everything that we want to improve, that we wanted to improve, but did not have time to do. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's the kind of thing where if you're late in production, somebody says, hey, I have this great idea that'll make the skin textures look better. You have to look at it and evaluate it and say like, yeah, we do not have time. We can't afford to break everything now. So, Uncharted 2, we were able to start really learning how to use the cell processor, and that gave us a lot more leeway in doing more realistic lighting and realistic skin textures like screen space, ambient occlusion, all these new techniques. And that's kind of why the visual fidelity between 1 and 2 is just this massive leap. There's all these things that we've been thinking about and working on that we just finally had time to do. My priority was just continuing to get good, believable performances. And, when they were able to implement realistic skin textures and things like that, it just meant that my characters were going to look better delivering their performances. Likewise with the eyes. The eyes is something that we've always struggled with. And, it gets progressively better from game to game. Well, animating eyes is actually hard, and it's important that you keep them alive at all times. Nobody ever stops moving their eyes for very long unless they're, dead or catatonic. Even if I'm looking at you, my eyes are doing these little movements called saccades that just indicate that there's little twitches happening on the muscles at all times. There's all kinds of other little performance things too, like if somebody is not telling the truth, they'll often look away from whoever they're talking to, like I just did. And likewise, if somebody is trying to think of something or search for things, they'll often look up, like I just did. But the fact is, like, eyes are really important because when you're doing face animation, that's where the people watching are going to go straight first. You know, they're not going to look at somebody's mouth. They're actually going to be looking at their eyes. The mouth is almost secondary to their interest.
What about just the transition from being passionate about keyframe animation to now having to deal with actors? Was that a big hurdle for you?
It was, but not in a bad way. The transition to working with actors is just all about like opening up new ways for collaboration, because that's really what this is. Because we don't just like take the motion capture and drop it in and call it done, you know, obviously we're all working on the performance together. You know, Nolan for Drake obviously is the one who like physically embodies and acts out Drake, but even still, we have to sort of take him back to the office and then in some cases make him look a bit more heroic. Some of the earliest challenges for me was like resisting the temptation to tell Nolan exactly what to do. When you do keyframe animation, you're so used to having full control over the character. Like, you know, I see Nolan on stage and I'm just so tempted to be like, could you like, when you point, could you like maybe keep your arm out just a little bit further? You know, you can't do that, right? You can give gentle nudges if they're not quite getting what you want. But, you know, most of the time, if you needed something to be a little bit more emphatic or if, you know, you weren't quite hitting the marks or things like that, that's just really easy for us to change. And that was actually something the actors had to get used to. Like, you know, a lot of them were used to doing on-camera work where they had to like hit their marks, they had to like look at the cameras, and we'd have to say, yeah, no, there are no cameras here. And if you're not standing in exactly the right space for when we compose the shot, then it's really easy for us to move over. So for them, I think that was something that was gave them a lot more freedom to sort of experiment and improvise. And that's something that we really encouraged on the set. Probably the thing that still amazes me was one of the biggest transitions we had from going Uncharted 1 to Uncharted 2 was that we had always wanted to do gameplay on moving objects. What we wanted to do in Uncharted 2 was to sort of free the designers up to really let their imaginations run wild so that like if they wanted to say have Drake play an entire level out on a moving train or in a collapsing building, that we could actually do that, these dynamic and moving levels. Mm-hmm. And that was really what I think made one of the biggest leaps of the Uncharted series was making those dynamic play fields. Because, you know, you have this train, you know, most train levels in video games, the train is moving straight the entire time. The train's not really moving, you know, they just sort of like jitter it back and forth to make it look like it is, but really what's happening is the background is moving and the train is standing still. But instead we actually made an environment that the train moved through and went around corners and under bridges and all this other crazy stuff while you were fully able to go into and out of the train. That's still my favorite level in the Uncharted series. You know, it was one of the first levels that we started designing and it was one of the last levels that actually got working at the end of the game.
Do you think you guys are tackling anything as challenging as the train level in Uncharted 4?
We're doing a lot of, I mean, the fact of the matter is we're doing a lot of new gameplay stuff in Uncharted 4. I mean, we're revamping all the different systems. You know, we have the new rope and grappling hook, obviously, and we're trying to figure out new and interesting ways that we can incorporate that into the gameplay. We have the new stealth mechanics. You know, we have the new climbing system that those guys have been working on. So it's all a challenge, you know. And, you know, we're carrying over all that technology for gameplay on moving objects. You know, as you saw near the end of the demo when he's like climbing up the rocks that start falling as he's on them. We're just able to implement it on like even smaller scales and bigger scales now.
Yeah, you want to talk about the biggest limitation that you always faced with the PS3 that is now just out the window?
Really the biggest limitation was just how much RAM and how much speed it had. You know, at a certain point you hit a wall and there's not too much. You can optimize to a certain amount. You can sort of really pack stuff in there. I mean, we did stuff in Uncharted 3 that I didn't think would have been possible based on what we'd done in Uncharted 2, but we somehow managed to do it. But you start reaching a point of diminishing returns, right? You know, the leap between 1 and 2 was much greater than the leap between 2 and 3. But, you know, now we have more hardware, now we have more RAM, now we have a lot more speed, now we're able to do a lot more with shaders and lighting, number of things happening on screen, physics, you know, all that kind of stuff. So, I mean, right now, we're still trying to figure out how to optimize our engine. We're still trying to figure out really what we can do. So, you know, whatever we do after Uncharted 4, I mean, we're going to take everything that we've learned from Uncharted 4 and probably like be able to bring it to the next level, which, you know, right now I can't even picture what that is because Uncharted 4 is looking pretty sweet. At the beginning of Uncharted 4, I was doing a lot of the same stuff as before, and we were really starting to, even before we had our engine up and running, we were trying to decide like what sort of interesting new things we could do with our cutscenes and things like that. And one decision that we made that we're sticking with is that we wanted to make all the cutscenes real time. Because on the previous Uncharted games and on The Last of Us, the cutscenes were created in our game engine and captured after the fact and then, you know, played back as movies. And, while that was cool and allowed us to sort of like, amp up the resolution of the characters and make everything look a little bit nicer, it also didn't allow for completely seamless transitions. Like, we were never able to get rid of like the moments of black before and after the scene began. Mm-hmm. And, Drake we were unable to make persistent. Like, if Drake had a rifle on his back in the game and then you go into the cutscene, he's not going to have the rifle on his back. And one of our goals is really to make the transition from cutscene back to gameplay in Uncharted 4 completely seamless. And what's nice about that is that one, if Drake's rolled through the mud prior to getting to the cutscene, he's going to be covered in mud in the cutscene still. If he's carrying a particular gun, it's not going to suddenly disappear. If we decide to do any fancy big head modes or things like that, that kind of stuff will carry over too. No promise of that though.
Do you miss hand animating things? Do you miss a more stylized approach to things at Naughty Dog?
I think, no, I don't, because we've got an amazing team of people making some really expressive performances with our current stable of realistic characters. I mean, animating the stylized stuff is a lot of fun, but, the stories that we're trying to tell right now are a little bit more grounded and a little bit more grown up than they were back in the Jak and Daxter days. And, that's kind of reflected in the characters that we make. Like, I can't necessarily a game like The Last of Us that looks like Jak and Daxter necessarily working all that well. Although you never know. I'd like to see somebody try. But, for us, no. I mean, we've kind of like moved into this new realm. And, I'm sure the animators would love to have an opportunity to go back and animate that stuff because it's a lot of fun. It is a lot of fun. But, if we were to do that, we would have to come up with the right project to do it with.
Do you think it's just the studio maturing and people getting older and they're just less interested in the kiddie stuff now?
I think that's part of it. I think it's also dictated by what the market wants to, And, that was a lot of what our decision was bounded based on, like, moving from Jak and Daxter to something more like Uncharted. And, it's also what we are interested in, too. One of the biggest challenges in the Uncharted series that, the designers and the writers have always come up with is the fact that, it is grounded in the real world. And sure, we've had these elements that are a little bit crazy, such as, the ability to survive all these things unscathed. But, the fact is, it's not going to be like Drake walks in and suddenly this giant space alien plops down anytime soon, right? So I think part of the fun that the animators had on The Last of Us was coming up with how all the clickers and bloaters and creatures moved, because that was something that we can't really do on the Uncharted series, right? Mm-hmm. So, I'm sure, everybody would relish the chance to do more stuff like that too. Well, the thing that I'm psyched most about Uncharted 4 is that, this is really our opportunity to take everything that we've learned from making the first 3 games and also from making The Last of Us and really sort of like try to distill it down into some really cool gameplay. And I'm really looking forward to it. I think it's going to be the best one yet.